Dr. Millstone, I appreciate your time. I'm grateful for you joining the podcast today. For the listeners, can you introduce yourself and let everyone know what your area of expertise is in?
Well, good afternoon. That's the time in the UK. My name's Erik Millstone. I'm a sort of semi-retired professor of science policy at the University of Sussex, and the area I've specialised in is food safety policy making. And I've been on the case since 1974, when my entire career changed direction, because I read an article in the New York Review of Books in March 74. The article was called Death for Dinner. And I was surprised by the contents and have been pursuing the topic ever since.
What was the contents of that article or that book that you read that made you want to focus on this?
It was arguing that I was naive to think that we were all eating better than we had before. It was arguing that, especially the US junk food industry, was selling nutritionally impoverished food. So the processing was often damaging the nutritional quality of the food, and that the food industry was then adulterating the food with colorings and flavorings and additives to change various features of the product, and that we couldn't be at all confident they were safe, and some were evidently harmful, and that the food industry would make a lot of money over that. And also at the time, I think it said that average life expectancy in the US was no longer rising, but had started to decline. And so my response was to think, well, I wonder if the same's true in this country. And I contacted the relevant part of the British government in the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. And I eventually got to speak to some people about it, and they weren't just dismissive, they were contemptuous, along the lines of, go away, little man, and get your nose out of our business. I mean, if they'd just been polite to me, I'd have gone off and studied something completely different. But they were so insulting and dismissive, my response was to think, they must have something to hide. I'm going to look into this. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
At what point in our history did food contaminants and these crazy chemicals that are integrated into our food system, what was the shift in our history? Was it the turn of agriculture, like to make food more shelf stable? I don't think there's probably one just answer, but can you point to a time and maybe a why?
Well, a lot of it had to do with industrialization, the shift of population from the rural areas to the urban areas. And yes, when you ask what the food industry, why they used such huge quantities of food additives, they always start by saying, to make it safer. And indeed, there is a role for particularly preservatives that makes food safer by inhibiting the growth of bacteria and molds and things like that. But however you count it in terms of money, numbers of compounds, or physical quantities of material added to the food supply, preservatives account for way less than 1% of food additives. The vast proportion are what I call cosmetics. Colorings, flavorings, things to change the texture, things to make a product foam or stop it from foaming, change the mouthfeel. Yeah. What the food industry technologists like to call the organoleptic properties. And they're manipulated. Yes, what's it? I've got up on the shelf behind me there an advert I found in the 70s in the US that said, "We've just invented a great new flavor, counterfeit chocolate." So it's much easier, it's much cheaper to manufacture a product with imitation chocolate colouring and flavouring than it is to use real cocoa. And the same whether it's raspberries or prawn or whatever. So additives are used to keep the manufacturer's cost down, but not to keep the price of the final product down. It's used to increase the margins. So basically what the junk food industry does is take cheap and plentiful ingredients and transform them into scarce, expensive, nutritionally impoverished and chemically adulterated products. And they make a huge amount of money in the process.
One aspect that, as an American, that's frightening is that the U.S., the FDA, is pretty laxed compared to other countries when it comes to banning toxic chemicals from our foods. And you see that Europe and other countries are a little bit more thoughtful and aggressive when it comes to making companies prove that their ingredients are less harmful. And maybe you have a different take on it because you live there, but it seems like y'all are doing better.
Well, no, I agree. I think at the moment, food standards in the UK and Europe are higher than those in the USA, but that has only been the case since the culmination of what I would call the mad cow disease saga in Britain and Europe. Mad cow disease and the rumpus that caused had a fundamental impact on standards in Europe. Interestingly, when I started this work, standards in the US were noticeably higher than they were in Europe. The food industry had even more influence over UK and European standards than was the case in the US. And this was partly, well, it was because of a lot of concerns about the growing concerns about cancer, the rapid increase in incidence of cancer in the USA, and particularly a piece of legislation called the Delaney Amendment, which said that no chemical should be permitted in the food supply if there's evidence that it causes cancer. And it was also it was partly the incidence of cancer, the concern to avoid cancer. The other thing that made a big difference in the USA was the introduction of legislation on freedom of information. Looking at you on my screen, I would judge that you're noticeably younger than I am. So you may not remember the Vietnam War, but one of the consequences of the publication of so-called Pentagon Papers revealing an undeclared bombing campaign by the USA in Cambodia. So the Johnson administration was concealing a lot of what it was doing from Congress, and Congress was furious with that. They couldn't exercise their mandate for oversight. And they introduced freedom of information legislation. And, that was mostly intended to deal with military affairs, but it had a huge impact on the regulation, for example, of chemicals, because all of a sudden, the evidence had to be in the public domain. And once it was in the public domain, it was clear that the evidence was not clear-cut, cut and dried. It was ambiguous. It was equivocal. But freedom of information legislation didn't emerge in Europe until the late 90s or into this century. I remember I would often ask the UK government for information, for documents, and they would give me, how shall I put it, they'd give me a 2-word answer, the second of which was off. And so I'd go to Washington and go into the Food and Drug Administration and say, "Can I please see these documents?" And people there would point at the files on the shelves in the photocopier and utter my favorite few words, which was, "Help yourself." I mean, it even got to the point in the late 1990s when the British government asked me for a copy of a document that it had itself refused to give me. I mean, I never figured out whether they never had it in the first place or they'd had it and lost it.
Mm.
But secrecy facilitates corruption, and freedom of information doesn't prevent corruption, it just makes it a bit harder.
When you started uncovering some of these chemicals being used in food and still do to this day, what is the reception like from the public and these companies? I imagine you have a target on your back from some of these people.
Well, I've yet to be physically attacked by either industry or government, but I've had many threatening lawyers' letters. Oh, yes. But the reception it's interesting. There's a huge variation. So I have to acknowledge that I do actually get a lot of public support in this country from ordinary citizens who, yeah, go for it, Eric. You know, we need people like you and so on. And that's wonderful. And both individuals and civil society groups, non-governmental organizations, and so on, concerned with protecting public health, consumer interests, or the environment. I'm not seeing it with quite such generosity and kindness by the food industry. I mean, you know, the food industry is not homogeneous. There are good bits in there, worst parts, and the worse they are, the more hostile they are. Actually, until, interestingly enough, one of the battles we've had in this country was over the idea that the UK should leave the European Union, so-called Brexit. And I argued strongly against Brexit, and I argued that Brexit represented a serious threat to UK food security in several important respects. You know, for food it could diminish the flow of food to Britain. It could make it more expensive, less safe, more toxic. It would increase the inequalities between rich and poor, and it's doing all of those things. But then large food companies that have been hostile towards me for 30, 40 years, all of a sudden were saying, yeah, you tell them, Eric, you know, we're on your side. Because the food industry recognizes that it was a threat to them as well. I mean, food prices are rising, big supermarket chains aren't happy, and the big manufacturers aren't happy as well, because you know, the politicians favouring leaving the EU, what they wanted once the UK was outside the EU was what they called a bonfire of red tape. Let's dismantle and discard the regulations. We don't need all this. These pointless rules and regulations tying the hands of industry. Let them go free. But the industry was saying to the government and these Brexit ideologues, you're crazy. You know, if we lower our standards, the European Union will ban all our exports from the UK to the European Union. They are our closest and largest market. Why shoot ourselves in both feet and the knees? You know, but still,
it's wild.
Ideology can often trump mere facts.
Specifically, getting into some of these additives, what are maybe the most potent or harmful to humans that are currently banned in the UK or Europe, but not banned in the US? One that I read was potassium bromate or something.
Bromate. Yeah, potassium bromate. Indeed, potassium bromate. What does the bakery trade like to call it? Look in my document. I think. Let's see. Yes, it's used in the bakery trade. They call it a a flour improver, or dough improver. What it does is it helps a loaf or a roll to, as it were, to swell up and be physically larger for a given amount of ingredients. So it can it can give a lighter seeming loaf, and it can give the consumer what might look like a larger loaf and possibly better value for money, but actually mostly is full of air and moisture. And so a lot of large corporate bakeries like to use it, but it is judged not to be acceptably safe in Europe. But I think there are much larger, more important differences between standards in Europe and those in the US. Can I point to something different? This has to do with hygiene standards in poultry production. In Europe, the rules specify that when you have, a shed full of chickens, or huge. I mean, when I say shed, it's not not like something in the backyard. These are vast industrial establishments. But when the birds in those sheds are at their slaughter weight, off they go to slaughter. And in Europe, before the next group of chicks are brought into the shed, the rules specify that the shed has to be disinfected and cleaned out. The same rule does not apply in the US. So they just bring in young chicks into a shed feces of the previous consignments of birds. And one of the consequences of all of this is that the levels of poisonous bacteria that contaminate the carcass, the bodies and then the carcasses of chicken, but then also turkeys, is way higher in the US than it is in Europe. The US then permits that after slaughter, after defeathering and slaughtering and butchering of the carcass, the carcasses and the cuts of meat can be washed with, what do they call it? Pathogen reduction treatments, I think, PRT, which are chemicals intended to disinfect the poultry. And so the poultry is then sold with some residual germs on it, plus the chemical that was used. Now, that's not permitted in Europe. We have instead of permitting the chemical treatment, we have higher standards of hygiene. But a really important piece of work emerged from some scientists at the University of Southampton a few years ago, which provided evidence showing that at least one of the chemical treatments, the pathogen reduction treatments, didn't kill the bacteria, didn't even diminish the bacteria. It merely blocked the standard test by which the presence of bacteria was normally established. So it wasn't an effective disinfectant. It was just blocking us from knowing that they were contaminated, or the US from knowing they were contaminated. And the figures that I've seen suggest that the rates of food poisoning from bacteria, such as Salmonella, botulism, Listeria, and so on, and Campylobacter, are far higher in the US than they are on this side of the Atlantic. Something like 10 times higher. I mean, it's slightly tricky because different countries have slightly different ways of gathering the statistics and so on. But when you dig down into it, I think it's fair to say that the American food supply, and particularly the American meat supply, is far more contaminated with bacteria than will be permitted in Europe. And that's not just poultry meat, actually. It's the same for beef and the same with fish. Yeah. And I think that's a much bigger problem, say, than the potassium bromate.
Mm. So are you a fan of, or what do you know about sustainable farming practices? Like regenerative is a buzzword.
Okay. Regenerative farming is, as far as I understand it, farming that's intended to diminish and improve the environmental impact of farming on the landscape and flora and fauna. In doing so, it may improve the health value of the food to consumers, but that's not its main target. I think that what's needed is reforms to our food production processing systems that diminish the adverse environmental impact and enhance and improve the nutritional quality of the food and its safety in terms of germs, fewer germs, and fewer harmful chemicals.
What are some of the ways to accomplish that, though?
Well, a term that's increasingly used in Britain is talking about agroecological agriculture.
Yes.
So agriculture that doesn't, which has its similarities to regenerative agriculture. Yeah. So it's about taking care of the soil and the environment and so on. But it also needs to have very high standards of hygiene. But then it's not just about farming. It's also about what happens between the farm gate and our plate and the fork, because an awful lot of damage is done, both to our food supply and to our environment, in the distribution and processing and retail chain.
Yeah.
So it's not just about... So, yeah, farming's important, but it's not just about the farming.
Agreed. I think one major aspect of it, and I'm nobody, but just looking on the outside in, the whole distribution of food and the logistics of it, I feel like if we're going to make an improvement into nutrition and animal welfare and climate and human health, we need to rely on local farmers, local communities to feed each other. Right now, how the system works is we're shipping food all over the world. Each country is shipping food, and I know that's how companies make their money, and it's incentivizing to do that. But I don't think we really achieve health until we go back to local community.
Well, I don't disagree with you in many respects, though. Coffee and citrus fruit ain't never going to grow in Britain, I mean,
right.
I mean, I wouldn't say we must stop all international trade in food, but I think we should substantially diminish our reliance upon it. But also because, I mean, huge amounts of food are transported from countries in which the population is undernourished, and shipped or even flown to countries in which people are already eating excess calories.
Yeah.
So my view is, the way I like to phrase it is, I want to improve food security in the UK in ways that doesn't undermine food security in any of the countries with which we trade.
That's a good
I
point.
mean, I remember, God, I guess it was back in the late 70s or 80s, for example, there were food riots in Egypt while McCain was shipping Egyptian potatoes out of Egypt into Europe to produce oven chips. Um, One of the mistakes many people make is they look around the world and they see millions of hungry and starving people and assume that this must be because there simply isn't enough food in the world to go round. The reality is that in aggregate, there is more than enough food in the world, produced in the world annually, to feed everyone if it was equitably distributed. But the distribution is grossly inequitable and takes food from poor people, poor hungry people, and gives it to rich people who are increasingly suffering with overweight and obesity because they're eating too much.
Right. Well, we also make unhealthy food more readily available for those communities that are without means to actually buy healthier food. So there's a McDonald's in the poor part of town. There's more pizza places on the poor part of town. So
yeah, absolutely. No, you're entirely right there. And huge amounts of corn and soybeans produced in the US is not consumed by people, but by livestock. And what's the rate? You put 20 pounds of animal feed into a beef animal, you get 1 pound of beef and 90 pounds of crap come out the other end. I mean, it is a system that is grotesquely wasteful and contributes both to the poor health of the people who eat the overly rich diets and condemns millions to being hungry and ill-nourished. Actually, I talk about, there are two kinds of malnutrition: too little food and too much, and they're both the opposite sides of the same coin. They're both produced by the same crazy economic system.
Hopping back on some other chemicals that are poisonous to humans, what are some other ones that are commonly used in American foods that aren't used in foods in the UK or Europe?
Well, what we got here, I have a list in front of me.
Yeah, we don't have to go through all of them.
Brominated vegetable oil. If you want to know more about this, what I would recommend your viewers to do is to go to the website of a splendid organization based in Washington, D.C., called the Center for Science in the Public Interest, CSPI. The vast proportion of their work is about food, and their website is full of useful information. Indeed, the document I have in my hand today, it is a document produced by my friends at the Center for Science and Public Interest. So, brominated vegetable oil. Now, this is used to give, it says here, a cloudy appearance to soft drinks like Mountain Dew. Not a product with which I'm familiar. Yeah, but it's not permitted for use in Europe.
What are
titanium dioxide? There's another. That's a coloring.
Oh, Skittles, right? And Skittles.
You tell me. I don't know. It's been a while since I've been in the USA, and
yeah, I think it's Skittles.
And while I would spend a lot of time reading labels on food products, I'm not sure what it's used on at the moment.
Can you talk about some of the health concerns from the brominated vegetable oil?
Oh, yes. Brominated, yes. It says here, Well, yes, brominated vegetable oil has been shown to cause cancer in laboratory animals.
Hmm.
Yes, it's used, how does it say, to create a more appealing crumb structure in baked products. I mean, one of the reasons why the food industry gets away with the crap it does is because of the perverse ways in which decisions are made. This is criticism of a lot of decisions taken by the Food and Drug Administration. And while the European Food Safety Authority may be a bit better, they're not exactly perfect by any stretch of imagination. But often what happens is they do experiments with laboratory animals. And if there's no evidence of harm in the laboratory animals, they say, oh, that proves it's safe. Hmm. They do the experiment and evidence of harm emerges. Oh, well, now that's only in the animals, and we can't necessarily extrapolate from animals to humans because there are all these differences, and the doses were high, and humans don't eat them, and all kinds of excuses. And it is, of course, the case that every study's got shortcomings. No study's perfect. But the imperfections in the reassuring studies are almost entirely ignored. But the minutest imperfection in studies suggesting harm get picked on and highlighted and treated as well. That study's completely worthless. Even though, and I've shown this in great detail in relation to the additive that I've studied most thoroughly, which is the artificial sweet aspartame, or aspartame, you call it, also sold it by its brand name of NutraSweet. The imperfections in the studies indicating harm are vanishingly slight by comparison with the imperfections in the studies that don't show harm. I mean, most of the studies that don't show harm because the doses used were too small, the number of animals was too few, the period of the duration of the study was too short. If you want, you can easily design a study that'll give you reassuring results. And it's the companies who either conduct the studies for themselves or subcontract it to commercial labs, and they are not being paid to find out whether or not the product is safe. They're being paid to generate evidence sufficient to enable them to persuade the authorities to permit their product. That's the game they're in. And another thing I've been complaining about for a couple of centuries is the extent to which the advice on the acceptability of these chemicals is so frequently made, it frequently comes from people who are paid consultants of the companies whose product they're judging. And I consider that profoundly unacceptable. There is something else going on as well, because to some extent, the US Food and Drug Administration has diminished the extent to which they permit paid consultants to be on their advisory bodies. But an organization like the Food and Drug Administration is concerned not just to protect the public, it's concerned to protect its own reputation. And one of the consequences of that is they're very reluctant ever to acknowledge that they ever made a mistake in the past. Because if they admit they've made mistakes, the question might be, well, if you made mistakes on that case, what about all those other cases? So its institutions become incredibly rigid. And, as it were, the amount of evidence that's required to get, say, a food additive taken off the market is far greater than the amount of evidence that was required to get it on the market in the first place. The hurdle you have to leap over gets higher and higher as time goes by.
You mentioned aspartame, that you've spent a lot of time studying aspartame. Can you talk about some of those health consequences and what aspartame is most commonly in, or some of the biggest discoveries that you?
Aspartame is very widely used in so-called diet soft drink, but in thousands of other artificially sweetened products. I'm sorry, but I don't have the time to go into enormous detail on the aspartame saga, but I'll give you a quick summary of the main points. And it's not just about, is the product harmful? And I think there's clear evidence that it may well be. It's rather that it should never have been approved in the first place. Okay. It was, when it was first discovered, this new sweet compound, the company that discovered it was testing it, and it was also being tested in a contract commercial testing lab. And they were feeding it to rats, and some of the rats died in experiments. And instead of dissecting those rats and see whether there was evidence that the chemical might have killed those rats, they just put those rats in the bin and put fresh rats in the cages and pretended they were the same rats. But they then got caught doing so because of some work by a very astute FDA official back in the 70s, a hero of mine called Adrian Gross. They got caught, and then there was this massive, complex, slowly evolving corporate cover-up jointly by the company and the US government, because the US government had initially given its approval and didn't want to admit it's made a mistake. Anyway, but nonetheless, throughout the 70s, it wasn't approved. But, and again, you and your viewers of the podcast may well not recall these events, but in the dying months of the Carter administration, some Islamic terrorists truck bombed the US embassy in Beirut, so that when Ronald Reagan came into office in early 81, he needed a new embassy and a new ambassador to Beirut. So the job of a new ambassador to Beirut is what one might call the shortest straw in Washington, the least attractive job. And the job was taken by a man who was at the time the head of the NutraSweet operation. He boasted to his final sales conference that he had made a deal with the Reagan team that he'd go to Beirut in exchange for them getting aspartame onto the market. And his name was Donald Rumsfeld, who you may recall was Defense Secretary under George W. Bush. Through the 80s and early 90s, evidence was emerging indicating that a small portion of consumers, probably no fewer than 3%, no more than 10% of consumers, were suffering acute neurological symptoms from consuming aspartame. So at the minimum, it was things like blurred vision or headaches. And at worst, in a few cases, they were sort of epileptic type seizures. So that was bad enough. But then it got worse. In the 1990s, into this century, a set of very thorough studies was conducted on aspartame by an independent research institution based in the city of Bologna in Italy called the Ramazzini Foundation. And they they didn't just do a standard US toxicological test, which used 3 doses, low, medium, and high, in male and female rats, of 50 per dose per gender, plus a matching set of controls. So that is 400 animals for a duration of, well, with mice it would be usually 18-20 months. With rats it would be 30 months. The Ramazzini Foundation, I think, used 1,800 animals. So 6 dose levels, so a much larger study. And they didn't do what the euphemism used by these lab toxicology workers, as they say, we sacrifice the animals, that is to say, kill them. Ramazzini left the animals until they died of what in a lab context counts as natural causes. And they found clear evidence from both mice and rats of a dose-related increase in the incidence of cancers at a range of different locations in the animals' bodies. So this really created a huge rumpus. And the orthodox, the officials at the Food and Drug Administration and the European Food Safety Authority in the UK and at the World Health Organization dismissed that. Oh, that doesn't count. And the reasons they gave were spurious. Oh, it's non-standard. Yes, it's not. It's a non-standard study, but it's better than the standard. It's a lot better. Larger pop sample for longer duration, scrutinize a wider range of tissues within animals. Some of the animals there were high rates of respiratory infections in the animals as they got old. Yes, but the rates of respiratory infections in the treated animals wasn't higher than the control groups, and therefore it couldn't have accounted for the cancers in any way. Getting a cold doesn't give you cancer. If it did, we'd all be dead long ago. A whole load of spurious excuses have been given to discount those. So, frankly, I think anyone who consumes aspartame and gets neurological symptoms like headaches or blurred vision should stop immediately. But for the rest of people, I wouldn't touch the stuff. I don't want to get cancer. But also interesting, there's another fascinating fact about the whole artificial sweetener business. There is increasing evidence showing that consuming artificial sweeteners does not help people lose weight. On the contrary, the evidence increasingly suggests that they're appetite stimulants. When it comes to weight control or weight loss, they're at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive. So rather than switch between sugar and artificial sweeteners, I say just get used to a less sweet diet. It's not that difficult.
Yeah.
And live a longer, healthier life.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Millstone, I know we're on time here, and I want to be respectful for your time. I greatly appreciate your work you're doing and the time that you set aside today. Are you on social media or anything, or how can people follow you?
Oh, no, I don't. Oh, no, not at my age. I can't cope with the flow of emails. I want to spend less time looking at screens, not more.
Okay. Well,
I got an email address at the University of Sussex.
Okay.
People can find me there and send me some electrons. But,
Well, your work is very important, Dr. Millstone, and I greatly appreciate it. And I'll email you this. I'll be one of the last emails that we'll send back and forth when this podcast comes out. So I appreciate your time, man.
Please do.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Take care. Bye.